in our first fall, we're also going to need to understand what will lift this character up to try again. Why will this character attempt to do this again? And again, this is an imitation of life. What motivates us to go again? What motivates us to try again? What we're going to see in the upward slope of the arc is that this is where backstory is established and comes into play. Backstory can be anything that's going to give us some element of the story that happened back before this particular story. That's why it's called backstory. An example could be for our cop, that before he was out chasing and trying to get this particular guy, where our film actually started with him going to the bank, his initial status quo is him trying to chase this criminal right after a bank robbery. Then we're introduced to the other characters, his partner, his sergeant. He then is called into an office where the CIA is there. That guy you were trying to chase that eluded you is actually a terrorist, but you're actually the only person who's gotten the closest to him. We want you to help us find him. You have all that going on. What you don't have going on, and you may know it in dialogue you may have discussed about his wife or introduced that he's married, or we may have had an image of him with a wedding ring, but we don't know the story of his wedding. We don't know the story of his marriage. So if in here now, after his first fall, after that terrorist, the guy that he's trying to go after, really eludes him and knows now that he's going after him as a terrorist, not just as a bank robber, he may have a conversation with his partner saying, you know, it may be a scene where he was locked out of his house. He comes over to his partner's house. What's going on? Oh, me and my wife, we're not doing well. Where our marriage is on the rocks. And so this is backstory. This is giving us a story about this character that may exist before the moment in time of this film. Backstory in that scenario is given through dialogue. So just because it happened before this moment in time doesn't mean that it's always a flashback. That will be the best way for you to deliver backstory. In fact, the most common and strongest way to deliver backstory is through dialogue. Dialogue that's current and in the moment of the film. So his conversation, so giving him to where he's kicked out of his house, that's in the moment of the film. That doesn't have anything to do with him following his objective and his last fall. Instead, it's story, that the backstory, being kicked out of his house, him standing, a shot of him standing in front of his house where he can't get the keys, and his wife closed the blinds or closed the curtains. That's backstory. That story that's not taking place in the currency of him trying to get, you know, this terrorist, but instead it's in the currency of time. So it's present right there in the moment. So backstory does not always mean flashback. He goes on and has a conversation with his partner so that he can stay in his place, and then we are getting through dialogue, yeah, me and my wife have always had troubles. So that's what we're getting there. So for our priest, we may decide to give our priest backstory in a flashback. We may decide that's the best way for the priest story. An example of the backstory that may exist for the priest, and specifically what he's dealing with in his story, is we may go to a flashback of his mother when he's a very little boy telling him he must always be good. He must always be a good man. And his mother may be telling him he's naturally wicked and he's naturally bad. And so he must work through that to be a good man. And she may give the priest as an example. You see Father Lopez? He is a good man. He is a good man. You must be a good man. Be like Father Lopez and be a good man. And so that may be something that is given in the story as backstory. So we may flash back for the priest to understand, why is it so important to him? Why is it so hard for him that if he has doubts, simply leave the priesthood? Why does he feel that he must remain faithful to these vows and faithful to this faith that he's starting to have doubts about? Backstory is going to explain that and give rise to that. The other thing that backstory does, in addition to motivate our character, is the backstory raises the stakes. So for our priest, it's very clear to see how backstory, hand in hand, raises the stakes. Now that we see that the priest doesn't just have this priesthood to lose, it's not just his vocation, equivalent of his job to lose, but he has his very sense of self to lose. He has this sense of feeling that he's worth it as a human being, because we see that these things are tied to each other. The backstory shows us that he's got a lot at risk. For our cop, we have the backstory laid out that he's been kicked out, he has troubles with his wife, he has troubles with his marriage, and that backstory will increase the stakes by him discovering or finding out, their antagonist reaching out and letting him know that he's now got his wife, and he's holding his wife, his life at danger if the cop doesn't stop trying to pursue him. So now our stakes are risen with our story because of backstory. Our stakes are risen with our protagonist because he doesn't just have this job that he's doing. He doesn't just have this terrorist that he risks losing, but now he has his wife that he risks losing. So your backstory delves into the psyche, the emotional life, or the interpersonal relationships of your protagonist to raise the stakes of the story. That, if we could put big vocabulary up and say, here now is vocabulary, the backstory delves into the psyche, the emotional life, or the interpersonal relationships of your character to raise the stakes of your protagonist, not just any character, your protagonist, to raise the stakes. That's what's happening here. So now we have our character again attempting to achieve the goal, and this time when he falls, he's going to fall hard. He's going to fall much lower than he did in the first fall. This is the last obstacle. We call it the last obstacle as opposed to the second obstacle because this is the last fall. And we call this the last fall as opposed to the second fall because some screenwriters choose to have multiple obstacles for this character, for their character to face. So just like our first fall is an obstacle, our last fall is an obstacle. But our last fall is not always the second one. So some some story arcs look like this. Going down into this moment. If you notice that with most of your arcs here, these are some Blake Snyder, Save the Cat, will call them false victories. So he actually calls this moment here a false victory. We're up at a really high point. Your protagonist is nearing his goal. He's gonna make it, he's gonna achieve it, but then he doesn't. Or it has the pretense of that he's achieved it. So with our cop, he's actually forged into the hideaway that he believes the terrorist is staying in, opens the door, goes through, shoots a bunch of other people, because this is an action film, remember? So he's got all this action that he's got to, this high stakes, fight choreography that he's going through, and yet he gets into the innermost sanctum, opens the door, and it's empty. The terrorist isn't there. So false victory. Instead, there's a tape, a video that's playing that says, haha, you thought you got me, something like that. But these moments, these falls, each are getting a little bit lower. Each one being lower than the next. Each one being more detrimental than the next. And so these obstacles in here are multiple obstacles that some screenwriters may choose to include. If you see the film Gravity by Alfonso Cuarón, you will see that he has many of these obstacles for his protagonist, Sandra Bullock, to face. And her obstacles are not a specific antagonist. Her obstacles are nature, the nature of space, and that it has no oxygen and no gravity, those things that we need as humans to live. So in his film, he very much brings many obstacles for her to face, and then she does get to her last fall, in which she decides that she's going to give up and she's going to die. And that is why the last fall is also called the lowest point. This is the lowest emotional point of your character. This is where your character really truly feels that all is lost. In classical films, the films that have been told throughout time from about the 1915 to around the 1950s, for our action film, our cop would at this point believe his wife is dead, or his wife has been shot, she is near death. That would be as low as he can get. And we understand that that's low because of how well developed the backstory is. Each thing, just like we want to be invested in our protagonist, and to be invested in our protagonist, we need to understand their objective or their desire, their flaws and their strengths. In our backstory, we really need to understand what is important to our protagonist. Why does this raise the stakes? Why does the trouble with his wife, the backstory, why does that raise stakes when she is now caught and her life is at risk? Because we know that he really loves her. As many troubles as he has, he does not want to lose her without repairing his relationship with her. The same thing for our priest. His backstory, his mother told him he was no good unless he was a priest, that he was not worthy unless he could prove how good he was with this external expression of goodness as priesthood, or even an illusion of goodness as priesthood. And so for him, he does not want to, he's come so low, it could be the relationship with his mother, that she may be on her deathbed, and he doesn't want her to die without him proving to her, or having her give him that sense of approval that he is good. A lot of times your last fall does involve death, but it should not involve death in a gimmicky way. Blake Snyder in Save the Cat, he writes that your lowest point, your last obstacle, your last fall is going to need to have death, even if it's just that the protagonist goldfish dies. That is not the strongest way to approach it. Death is not always in the physical dying of something. Death can be representative. So it could be something that a character has lost. In a love story, it could be that a woman who is estranged from the man she loves has a locket with a little locket of hair that she's clipped inside of this locket around her chain. And so for her, this is what connects her to her lover, that they are, distance apart from each other, and there's everything keeping them apart, but this means something to her. And if she were to lose that locket, that could be representative of loss. That could be representative of death. That could bring her to her lowest moment, or be present. I'll put it that way. It doesn't bring her to her lowest moment, but it's present in her lowest moment. She's had her last fall, and then the locket is lost. And so that could then be a metaphorical expression of death. And that's something that you want to do. It needs to be present, but it doesn't need to be used as a gimmick. You don't want to just kill something off for no reason. You want to actually have death present. If there's no call in your story for someone to die, then you want a metaphorical expression of the character letting go of something, of a part of the character dying. In Star Wars, this is done with Luke Skywalker's hand being cut off. So it's a part of, or being blasted off, and then when they repair it, he has an android hand. So it's a metaphor of him, part of him dying, of a piece of him that he has to let go of, that he has to shed. It also is a metaphor for making him more like his father, who is in a completely mechanized body, except for just his head, that now Luke Skywalker has a mechanized element of his body in his arm. So it can be something that is metaphorical, a metaphorical loss of the character, something the character has shed away. This is also going to move us into, because of how devastating this moment is, this story part of the arc is understood as the dark night of the soul. And the dark night of the soul is a term that comes from Catholicism, in which saints have lost their faith. It's an extremely tumultuous, sad, miserable experience to go through. And it's a really strong metaphor for how you want your character to be in this, after this all is lost moment. You don't want them, all is lost, but then here comes, your savior, or then here comes the clue that's going to link you to the terrorist, or here comes something that makes it all better. You actually do want your character to sit in the reality of his loss. And in sitting in that reality and facing his own flaws, or facing his own things that have caused him to have this last fall, to keep trying and keep failing, and really seeing what is it that he or she is missing. Why aren't they achieving their goal? Why aren't they reaching where they want to go? This should be an extreme moment of misery and self-clarity, self-exploration, self-insight. And just as from where the term comes from, the dark night of the soul, just as it does as observed in reality, it does for your character. Once they break through, once they die and leave behind something, it clarifies them to see what they haven't been seeing the whole time. It's a moment of enlightenment. And that is why our arc is now moving upward. It's moving upward, and it's going to go to heights that it hasn't been before in the story. So this has a certain amount of anticipation that is now building and growing as we rise up to the highest moment that we've been. Notice that this point is higher than this point, just as this point is lower than this point.